James Mitchell made a promise that seemed impossible to keep, but what happened 2 years later proved that some words have the power to defy even death. And today, you'll discover how a simple sentence whispered in a moment of despair not only transformed two lives, but completely redefined what it means to love someone unconditionally. Imagine for a moment, you're about to marry the love of your life when fate brutally and definitively snatches that person from your arms. The government declares this person dead. You hold a funeral. You bury an empty casket. But something in your heart refuses to accept that reality. Comment below. Do you believe true love can transcend even death? Because this story will show you that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible becomes possible when two souls are truly connected. But what you don't know yet is that this connection will be tested in a way no one should ever have to experience. It was a morning in October 2016 when James Mitchell, then 25, first stepped into the small cafe near Central Park where Sarah Thompson worked as a barista. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and fresh coffee, mixed with the soft perfume of the autumn leaves just beginning to turn gold outside. The foggy windows created an intimate, almost cinematic atmosphere. James wasn't the typical patron of that establishment. His defined muscles and military posture contrasted with the bohemian vibe frequented mostly by college students and local artists. He wore a black leather jacket over a simple white t-shirt, but there was something in his brown eyes that conveyed an unexpected vulnerability. Sarah, 23, possessed a natural beauty that needed no artifice. Her light brown hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her green eyes shone with a light of their own when she smiled. That morning, she wore the standard cafe uniform, a dark green t-shirt and a brown apron, but she managed to make even that simple outfit look elegant. Their first encounter was almost comical. James, nervous for a reason he couldn't even comprehend, stumbled slightly as he approached the counter. Sarah pretended not to notice, but a discreet smile played on her lips. "Good morning. What can I get for you today?" she asked, her melodious voice cutting to the morning chatter. James looked at the menu for a few seconds, but his attention was completely focused on her. Maybe you could recommend something? I'm new to the area. Just moved to New York? Sarah asked while preparing a cappuccino for another customer, her movements fluid and practiced. Actually, I grew up in Brooklyn, but I just got back from being away for a while. I'm trying to rediscover the city. James didn't mention he had just completed basic military training and would start his life as a reservist. Sarah served him a double cappuccino with a perfect leaf design in the foam. When their fingers briefly touched as she handed him the cup, they both felt a subtle electricity that neither could ignore. "This coffee has something special," James said after his first sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "Family secret," Sarah replied with a mischievous smile. "Really, it's just regular coffee, but made with love." "Then maybe it's the love that makes it special," James responded, surprising himself with his own boldness. But fate had other plans that day. A blaring siren cut through the magical moment between them. James instinctively checked his military phone. An urgent message from his reserve unit was flashing on the screen. His expression changed instantly, from relaxed to tense. Sarah noticed the shift immediately. "Is everything okay?" she asked, genuinely concerned. James hesitated for a moment, as if making an important decision. "Sorry, I have to go. But..." He stopped, grabbed a napkin, and quickly scribbled his number. "I'd really like to continue this conversation. Maybe dinner, if you're free?" Sarah took the napkin, their fingers touching again. "I'd love that." "Great. I'll call you tonight." James hurried out, leaving behind not only his half-finished coffee, but also a Sarah who was intrigued and inexplicably eager to see him again. What she didn't know was that military message would change everything. 3 years had passed since that first meeting, and what began as an instant attraction had blossomed into something much deeper and more meaningful. James and Sarah built a routine together that was both comfortable and exciting. Every Tuesday morning, James would show up at the cafe at exactly 7:15 a.m. Sarah always had his double cappuccino ready before he even reached the counter. It was an intimate ritual that they both cherished like a secret treasure. "Your boyfriend's coming." The other employees would tease Sarah whenever they saw James approaching the establishment. "He's not my boyfriend," Sarah would reply, but her smile completely betrayed her. Over those 3 years, they created memories that seemed straight out of a romantic movie. Long walks through Central Park on Sundays, where they talk about everything and nothing at the same time. Movie nights where they watched old black and white films on Sarah's small TV. Homemade dinners where James would attempt to cook elaborate dishes, and Sarah would laugh fondly at his well-intentioned but disastrous efforts. James had become a constant presence in Sarah's life in a way she had never experienced before. He wasn't just her boyfriend. He was her best friend, her confidant, her safe person in a world that sometimes felt too chaotic. Sarah discovered that James had layers of personality that constantly surprised her. On the outside, he was strong, disciplined, the typical military reservist who took his commitments seriously. But in private, he could be incredibly vulnerable. He talked about his fears of not being good enough, his insecurities about the future, his dreams of building a family in a house with a garden where they could grow old together. "You know what my biggest fear is?" James asked one winter night, as they lay on Sarah's couch, her nestled in his arms. "Spiders?" Sarah joked, making him laugh. "No, seriously. My biggest fear is wasting the time we have together. Like I won't appreciate every moment because I assume there will always be a tomorrow." Sarah raised her head to look at him. "Why would you say that?" "Because in the military life, we're taught that nothing is guaranteed. But with you I want to believe we can have forever." These deep conversations connected them in a way that went beyond physical attraction. They shared dreams, fears, hopes, and even comfortable silences. Sarah felt like she had found her soulmate, that rare person with whom she could be completely authentic. But the universe was about to test that connection in an unimaginable way. In September 2019, James started acting strangely. Sarah noticed he checked his phone more often, had whispered conversations when he thought she wasn't listening, and sometimes she caught him looking at her with an intensity that was almost palpable, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of her face. "Are you okay? You seem worried about something," Sarah asked one Tuesday while making his usual cappuccino. James hesitated. "Actually, there's something important I need to tell you, but not here. Tonight, after you get off work." The tone of his voice sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. It wasn't fear exactly, but a premonition that something big was about to happen. "James, you're scaring me. Is it something bad?" He held her hands over the counter. "No, it's nothing bad. In fact, it might be the best thing I've ever done in my life. But I need to do it right." At that moment, Sarah had no idea that James had spent the last few weeks meticulously planning what would be the most important night of their lives. He had bought a ring 3 months earlier, after secretly talking to Sarah's mom to find out her preferred style. He had reserved the exact spot in Central Park where they had gotten to know each other better during one of their first walks. He had even checked the weather forecast to ensure the sky would be clear. But what he couldn't predict was how one simple question would not only change their lives, but test the limits of what it means to truly love someone. Central Park at sunset in October has a magic of its own. The trees, dressed in golden and orange hues, create a natural cathedral where filtered light dances among the leaves like celestial confetti. The air was crisp but not cold, laden with that unique fragrance of New York autumn, a mix of dry leaves, damp earth, and the promise of changes to come. James had chosen the Bow Bridge, that small cast-iron structure that gracefully arches over the lake, creating perfect reflections in the calm water. It was a spot where he and Sarah had their first official kiss. Not the quick, nervous one from their third date, but the long, passionate kiss that had sealed their fate 6 months later. Sarah arrived wearing a navy blue dress that floated gently around her knees, paired with a beige knit jacket James had bought her for her last birthday. Her hair was loose, blowing in the wind, and she wore that pink lipstick he loved. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was radiant in a way that only happens when someone is genuinely happy. "You're really acting very suspicious today," she said, lacing her fingers through his as they walked along the familiar path. James laughed, but his laugh sounded a little forced. He was nervous in a way he had never experienced before. He had faced combat simulations, intense military training, high-pressure situations, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. "Remember the first time we walked here?" he asked, slowing his pace as they approached the bridge. Of course. You tried to impress me by talking about the bridge's architecture, but you were completely wrong about when it was built. And you gently corrected me, even though you knew I was trying to sound smart. You were adorable. You still are. Sarah squeezed his hand. James, seriously, what's going on? You look like you're about to throw up. They stopped in the center of the bridge. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A few of the people were walking to the park, but in that moment for James and Sarah, the world had shrunk to just the two of them. James let go of her hand and took a step back. His eyes were shining with a mix of nervousness and determination that Sarah had never seen before. Sarah Thompson, he began, his voice slightly trembling. Over the last 3 years, you've transformed my life in ways I didn't even know were possible. Sarah's heart began to race. She had a suspicion of what was about to happen, but she didn't want to assume, didn't want to be disappointed if she was wrong. You've taught me that love isn't just an emotion, it's a choice we make every day. It's choosing to see the best in someone even on their worst days. It's choosing to stay when it would be easier to walk away. It's choosing to build something together, even when we don't know exactly what it will look like. James was speaking with more confidence now, the words flowing directly from his heart. You've made me want to be a better person, not because I wasn't good enough before, but because you've shown me that we can always grow. We can always love more deeply. We can always choose courage over fear. At this point, Sarah had tears in her eyes. She knew. She definitely knew what was about to happen. But fate had other plans. James slowly knelt on one knee. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small, dark blue velvet box. The lid opened with a small click, revealing a simple but stunning engagement ring, a classic solitaire of a round diamond in a delicate white gold setting. Sarah, his voice was laden with emotion. Will you marry me? The world stopped. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, tears now streaming freely. For a few seconds, she literally couldn't speak. All the words had disappeared from her mind, replaced by an overwhelming wave of love, joy, and the feeling that this was a moment her entire life had been a preparation for. Yes, she finally whispered. Yes, she shouted, laughing and crying at the same time. James slipped the ring onto her ring finger, his own hands trembling slightly. The ring fit perfectly. He had gotten the size right. Sarah looked at her hand, then at James, then back at the ring, as if she needed to confirm that this was really happening. It's beautiful, she said, admiring how the stone caught and reflected the golden light of the sunset. James stood up and pulled her into his arms, spinning her in the air. Some people walking to the park stopped to watch and applaud spontaneously. An older couple shouted congratulations from a distance. A small child asked her mother why that lady was crying, and the mother explained that they were happy tears. But in the midst of all that perfect happiness, James did something that wasn't planned. He held Sarah's face in his hands, looked deeply into her eyes, and said words that would echo through time in ways neither of them could imagine. Sarah, I promise you one thing. No matter what happens, no matter where life takes us, no matter what obstacles we face, I will always, always come back for you. This is a promise I make not just as your fiancé, but as someone whose soul is eternally connected to yours. They were words spoken in the heat of the moment, coming straight from the heart, without calculation or planning. But the universe was listening, and the universe was about to test them in a way that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, destiny, and the strength of promises made with an open heart. In that perfect moment, with the ring shining on her finger and James's arms around her, Sarah could never have imagined that those words would become both her anchor and her torment for the next 2 years. The months following the engagement passed in a golden haze of wedding preparations and shared dreams. Sarah had transformed into a more radiant version of herself, if that was even possible. She practically floated to the cafe where she worked, her engagement ring catching the light and eliciting admiring gasps from the regular customers. "Show me again," begged Maria, an elderly Portuguese woman who'd been drinking coffee there every morning for 15 years. Sarah obediently extended her left hand, watching as the diamond created tiny rainbows on the cafe walls when the morning light hit it at the right angle. "That man has good taste. Maria approved with a wise nod. But more importantly, he has good eyes. I can see how he looks at you. That's how my late husband used to look at me. These small validations filled Sarah's heart with a happiness she could barely contain. At night, she and James would sit in her small apartment with wedding magazines spread all over the coffee table, planning every detail of their celebration. They had decided on a ceremony in March 2020, a date that seemed perfect. Spring arriving, flowers blooming, the symbolism of renewal and new beginnings. Sarah dreamed a bouquet of white and pink peonies, James a honeymoon in Tuscany where they could stroll through vineyards and eat gelato in small medieval squares. How many people do you think we should invite? Sarah asked on a Tuesday night, chewing on the end of her pen as she made lists. I don't know. How many people can fit in the church you chose? 200. But we don't need to fill it up. I prefer something more intimate. People who really mean something to us. James agreed, but there was something in his expression that Sarah couldn't quite decipher. A subtle concern, almost imperceptible but present. Are you okay? She asked, putting the list aside. Of course. Why do you ask? I don't know. Sometimes you get that look, like you're thinking about something far away. James hesitated. He had received some communications from his reserve military unit about possible activations, but nothing concrete. He didn't want to worry Sarah with maybes and possibilities. Besides, the chances seemed minimal. He was only scheduled for local exercises in the coming months. It's just work. You know how it is. He pulled her into his arms. Nothing is more important than this right here. Sarah snuggled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. There was something incredibly comforting in that sound, constant, reliable, present. During those months of preparation, they created routines that felt like small rituals of intimacy. James would show up at Sarah's apartment every Thursday with ingredients for dinner, try to master a new recipe. Sarah reserved every Friday for them to browse home decor stores, imagining what the house they would buy after the wedding would look like. I want a big kitchen, Sarah would say, stopping in front of displays of household appliances. Why? You don't even cook. I'll learn. I want to make you breakfast every day. Even on weekends? Especially on weekends. Breakfast in bed, newspapers spread out, that delicious laziness of people who have the whole day ahead of them. James would smile, able to perfectly visualize that domestic scene. He wanted that as much as she did, the normalcy, the predictability, the security of an everyday love. But fate was weaving other plans. In January 2020, James started receiving more calls from his military unit. They were routine communications. He assured Sarah, just updates on training schedules. But Sarah noticed that these calls made him thoughtful in a way she hadn't seen before. Are you really okay? She insisted after a particularly long call one Sunday morning. Yes, babe. Just military bureaucracy. Nothing that will interfere with our plans. James genuinely believed that when he said it. After all, he was a reservist, not an active duty soldier. His role was primarily local support and periodic training. The possibility of an international activation seemed remote, but that same afternoon, while Sarah was taking a shower, James's phone rang again. The voice on the other end was more serious this time, more official. Sergeant Mitchell, I need you to report to base tomorrow at 0800 hours for an important briefing. Full uniform. Can I ask what it's about? Information will be provided tomorrow. Just make sure you're there. James hung up the phone with a strange feeling in his stomach. It wasn't panic, but an uncomfortable premonition that he tried to push away immediately. It was probably just a protocol update, maybe a new exercise schedule. When Sarah came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, her hair damp and her cheeks pink from the steam, James decided not to mention the call. Why worry her for no reason? What's with that face? Sarah asked, noticing his expression. Nothing. I was just thinking about how beautiful you are. It was true, but it was also a half-truth, and James hated lying to her, even if it was to protect her. That night, while Sarah slept nestled in his arms, James lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to push away thoughts he couldn't even name completely. There was something in the air, a subtle but perceptible shift, like the atmospheric pressure before a storm. He didn't know yet, but that would be one of the last nights of complete peace they would have together for a very, very long time. The military base was more bustling than usual that Monday in February. James immediately noticed a tension in the air. Soldiers walking faster, conversations in lower tones, a general sense of urgency he had learned to recognize during his training. Colonel Reynolds, a man in his 50s with graying hair and impeccable military bearing, entered the briefing room at precisely 8 a.m. 23 reservists were present, all in uniform and at attention. "At ease," the colonel ordered, his voice echoing in the Spartan environment. "What I am about to communicate to you today is of an urgent and confidential nature." James felt his stomach clench. Beside him, Marcus, a fellow reservist he had trained with for the past 2 years, was visibly tense. Due to the escalation of conflicts in the Middle East region and the immediate need for specialized reinforcements, this reserve unit has been activated for immediate deployment. You have 72 hours to get your personal affairs in order. Departure is scheduled for Thursday, 0600 hours. The silence in the room was deafening. James heard Marcus mutter a curse word. Another soldier murmured something about his pregnant wife. But James couldn't hear anything but the sound of his own heart beating erratically. Deployment. The word echoed in his mind like an alarm. Deployment meant leaving. It meant leaving Sarah. It meant postponing the wedding. It meant breaking promises he had made just 4 months earlier. Estimated mission duration is 12 months, with a possibility of extension depending on conditions on the ground. The colonel continued, "I know this is difficult for all of you. I know you have families, commitments, plans, but you swore to serve your country, and your country needs you now. 12 months, a whole year away from Sarah. The wedding in March was completely ruined. The honeymoon in Tuscany would have to wait. Everything would have to wait." During the rest of the briefing, James only heard fragments. Instructions about vaccinations, wills, power of attorney, life insurance. Words that seemed to come from another world, a world where people needed to prepare for the possibility of not coming home. When he was finally dismissed, James left the base in an almost catatonic state. The drive back to Manhattan passed in a blur of traffic and anxiety. He needed to tell Sarah. But how? How do you destroy the dreams of someone you love in a single conversation? He parked in front of the cafe where Sarah worked and sat in the car for 15 minutes, trying to find the right words. Trying to find any words that could soften the blow of what he was about to say. When he finally entered the cafe, Sarah was preparing a latte for a regular customer. She saw him through the window and waved cheerfully, that radiant smile that had become her trademark since the engagement. "What a nice surprise," she said as he approached the counter. "Weren't you supposed to be at the base today?" I'm done now." Something in the tone of his voice made Sarah stop what she was doing. She looked at him more closely, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the grave expression on his face. "James, what happened?" He looked around. The cafe was moderately full, customers chatting, music playing softly. It was not the place for that conversation. "Can you leave a little early today? I need to talk to you." "Sure, let me just tell my supervisor." Sarah managed to leave 15 minutes before the end of her shift. They walked in silence to a small nearby park, finding a secluded bench under a tree still bare from winter. "Sarah," James began, his voice coming out hoarse, "I have to tell you something that's going to be very difficult to hear." Sarah's hands instinctively went to her engagement ring, twisting it nervously. "You're scaring me. My unit has been activated. I have to leave on Thursday." "Leave? Leave for where?" "International deployment. The Middle East. For 12 months. Sarah's world literally stopped. She heard the words, processed their meaning, but her mind refused to accept the reality they represented. But we have the wedding. In March. Everything is planned. We've already paid the deposit for the church, the photographer, the caterer." I know, babe. We'll have to postpone." "Postpone?" Sarah's voice was rising in pitch and volume. "Postpone for how long?" "I don't know. Until I get back." "And when do you get back?" James hesitated. At least 12 months. Maybe longer. Sarah stood up from the bench abruptly, starting to pace in circles. Her hands were shaking. Her breathing was becoming irregular. No, 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 no. This can't be happening. Not now. Not after everything we planned. James stood up too, trying to reach for her, but she moved away. Sarah, please. I didn't choose this. You know I would never make you sad. Sarah Mitchell looked out the window of the apartment she had once shared with James, which now felt like a museum of memories frozen in time. 6 months had passed since he left for the war, and each sunrise brought the same torturous routine. Checking her phone for a message that never came, counting the days on a calendar that seemed to have stopped, and whispering prayers to a God who seemed to have forgotten her. The apartment was far too quiet, where laughter and intimate conversations about future plans and shared dreams once echoed. Now only the relentless tick-tock of the kitchen clock marked the endless hours. Sarah had been wearing James's military t-shirt for 3 consecutive days. The faded fabric still vaguely carried his woody scent, an olfactory anchor that kept her connected to the man she loved. The soft cotton was beginning to lose its smell, and that terrified her more than any news of war ever could. Her friends told her she was losing herself, that she needed to live. But how could someone live when half of their soul was on the other side of the world, in a place where bombs exploded and bullets flew? How could someone simply continue to exist when the person who gave meaning to every breath might be wounded, afraid, or worse? A possibility Sarah absolutely refused to consider. Her laptop vibrated with a video call, interrupting her dark thoughts. Her mother's worried face appeared on the pixelated screen, her brown eyes carrying that expression Sarah had known since childhood, the same one she wore when trying to convince her of something for her own good, like when she insisted she eat broccoli or do her homework before playing. "Honey, you need to get out of that apartment," her mother said, her voice filled with maternal concern that crossed the digital distance like a desperate, virtual hug. "When was the last time you went out for something other than work? When was the last time you truly laughed?" Sarah shrugged, avoiding the camera's direct gaze. Her hair was disheveled, pulled into a messy bun that hadn't seen a mirror in days. The truth was, she couldn't even remember the last time she had felt anything other than the constant anxiety that gnawed at her stomach like acid. The days blurred into a gray fog of anticipation and dread, where every phone notification made her heart race. Every doorbell ring made her run to the door, miraculously hoping to see James standing there with that crooked smile she loved. "I go out, Mom. I go to work. I go to the grocery store. I do the things I need to do." The words came out mechanically, as if she were reciting a to-do list instead of describing a life. "That's not living, Sarah. That's just existing. James wouldn't want to see you like this. Honey, he'd want you to be happy, to enjoy life while he can't be here to enjoy it with you." The mention of his name was like a stab between her ribs. Sarah felt her neck muscles tighten involuntarily, irritation bubbling like lava beneath her seemingly calm surface. Why did everyone always think they knew what James would want? As if they could speak for a man who was thousands of miles away, fighting for his life in a country she could barely locate on a map? "James is coming back," Sarah said, her voice taking on a defensive firmness she hadn't felt in months. "We're getting married in the spring, just like we planned. The dress is still hanging in the closet. The invitations are still in the drawer. Nothing has changed, Mom. He's just..." A little delayed. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the hum of the internet connection. Her mother looked away from the camera, and Sarah knew instantly, with that terrible intuition that only comes when you're about to discover something that will change your life forever, that there was something they weren't telling her. Something everyone knew but her. Something that hung in the air like an approaching storm, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Mom." Sarah leaned closer to the screen, studying every micro-expression on her mother's face. "What are you not telling me?" "Nothing, honey. It's just that. Sometimes things don't happen the way we plan. And when that happens, we have to be flexible. We have to..." "He's coming back," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising an octave. "He promised." James never breaks his promises. But even as she said it, an insidious little voice in the back of her mind whispered venomous doubts. What if he didn't come back? What if the war had swallowed him as it had swallowed so many other young men full of life and dreams? What if she was clinging to a fantasy, while reality was collapsing around her like a house of cards? That night, Sarah found herself at the military family support group, sitting in a circle of uncomfortable plastic chairs in a parish hall that smelled of stale coffee, hospital disinfectant, and the cheap perfume of women trying to look presentable while their lives slowly fell apart. The walls were decorated with faded motivational posters, courage, hope, strength, words that seemed to mock the brutal reality they all faced. Janet, the coordinator, a woman in her 40s with premature wrinkles that told stories of constant worry and sleepless nights, led the discussion with the tired efficiency of someone who had comforted hundreds of broken hearts over the years. Her eyes had that glazed quality of someone who had seen too much human pain. Communication blackouts are normal during certain operations. Janet explained to the group, her voice carefully balancing hope and realism like a tightrope walker. It doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong. Soldiers sometimes go weeks without being able to make contact due to operational security issues. One of the wives, a redhead with red and swollen eyes whom Sarah had seen crying silently during several sessions, whispered with a broken voice, "It's been 3 weeks since I heard from Mike. 3 weeks without a single word." Sarah felt her stomach clench in a familiar cramp of anxiety. 2 weeks for James," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible even to herself. 2 weeks that felt like 2 years. 2 weeks of obsessively checking email, phone, social media, looking for any sign of life. The women exchanged glances with that silent understanding that only those living in the same emotional storm can share. It was a look that said, "I know exactly how you feel, and it terrifies me too, because if it happened to you, it could happen to me." It was a solidarity of shared fear, of the raw and naked vulnerability of loving someone who was constantly in danger. After the meeting, Sarah walked slowly to her car, her footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot. The night air was cold and biting, and she pulled her coat tighter around her body. Above her, the stars shone with cruel indifference. Were they the same stars James was seeing on the other side of the world? Was he also looking up right now, thinking of her? Back in the apartment, Sarah prepared for another night of fragmented sleep and nightmares. She had developed an elaborate nightly routine, checking all the locks 3 times, leaving her phone on the loudest volume next to her bed, setting multiple alarms to wake up every 2 hours and check for messages. It was an obsessive ritual that she knew was irrational, but it made her feel as if she were doing something productive, as if her constant vigilance could somehow protect James across the distance. It was at 3:47 in the morning, when Sarah had finally managed to fall asleep after hours of staring at the ceiling and counting sheep that turned into marching soldiers, that the phone rang. The sound sliced through the silence like a sharp blade, and she woke up instantly, her heart racing like an overloaded engine. The screen showed military unknown number, and Sarah felt as if the world had stopped spinning, as if even time was holding its breath. With hands shaking so violently she almost dropped the phone twice, she finally managed to slide her finger across the screen to answer. "Hello." The word came out as a hoarse whisper. "Are you Sarah Thompson?" The voice on the other end was formal, professional, carrying an institutional weight that Sarah immediately recognized as a harbinger of devastating news. It was a voice she had imagined in her darkest nightmares, the voice that appeared in movies when everything was about to fall apart. "Yes, this is me." The words came out as a whisper, as if speaking louder might make the moment more real. "Miss Thompson, this is Captain Rodriguez from the U.S. Army Casualty Notification Department. We need to speak with you in person. We can be there within the hour." The phone slipped from her hand as if it had turned into molten lead, falling onto the blanket with a dull thud that echoed in her chest like a funeral bell. Sarah looked at it lying there, the screen still lit showing the call was active, but somehow knowing, with a primitive and terrifying certainty, that her life as she knew it had ended at that very moment. She didn't remember getting dressed or brushing her teeth or tidying the apartment even a little. Time had become a sticky, viscous substance, where minutes stretched into hours and hours passed like seconds. Suddenly, it was 8 in the morning and 2 Army officers were standing at the door of her apartment, their dark silhouettes framed against the cruel light of the hallway. Captain Rodriguez was a middle-aged man with graying temples and eyes that had seen too many tragedies. Beside him was Chaplain Murphy, an older man with a kind face marked by decades of comforting broken families. Both were in impeccable uniforms, every medal and insignia polished until they shone, as if the perfection of their appearance could somehow mitigate the horror of what they were about to say. They removed their covers when she opened the door, the automatic and respectful gesture of soldiers trained for this terrible moment. Their faces were masks of professional composure built over oceans of forcibly contained compassion. "Miss Thompson," Captain Rodriguez began, his voice carefully modulated to convey both authority and compassion. "On behalf of the United States Army, I deeply regret to inform you that Sergeant James Mitchell has been declared killed in action." The words hit Sarah like physical bullets, each syllable piercing her consciousness and shattering her reality. Her legs gave way instantly, as if her muscles had simply forgotten how to work, and she clung to the doorframe to keep from collapsing completely onto the floor. The world around her turned into a trembling image, as if someone had broken the lens through which she viewed reality. "No." The word came out as a whisper, then louder. "No. No, this isn't. He promised. He looked into my eyes and promised he would come home." The words came out as desperate screams, as if she could refute reality through the sheer force of denial, as if her refusal to accept could somehow alter the facts. Chaplain Murphy stepped forward, his kind eyes reflecting decades of experience in delivering the worst news imaginable to people who were not prepared to hear it, who could never be prepared. "I'm so sorry for your loss, my dear. James was a hero. He died serving his country. He's not dead. He's not dead." Sarah screamed with an intensity that lacerated her throat, a primitive and animal refusal to accept the unacceptable. It was a cry of a child who had lost her favorite toy, amplified to become the lament of a woman who had lost her reason for living. She collapsed to the floor like an imploding building, and the officers moved to help her, but she repelled them with frenzied movements, as if their touch could make the news more real. "How?" she managed to ask between sobs that shook her like internal earthquakes. "How did he die?" Captain Rodriguez exchanged a quick look with the chaplain, and Sarah saw hesitation there. There was an explosion, an improvised device. He and his unit were. There were no survivors, ma'am. It was instantaneous. He did not suffer. But Sarah barely heard the last words. Her mind had fixated on explosion and no survivors, and those words echoed in her head like funeral bells, drowning out everything else. James, her James with his gentle hands and infectious laugh, had been reduced to nothing, only memory and pain. The following days passed in a blur of pitying faces, empty words of condolence, and the unbearable sound of dirt hitting an empty casket during the funeral. Sarah sat in the front pew of the church, wearing a black dress James had never seen. She had bought it specifically for the funeral, a piece of clothing whose only function was to mark the end of her happiness. She stared blankly at the carefully folded American flag that was supposed to represent James's entire life, and she couldn't process the idea. How could a flag contain his laughter? How could a piece of fabric, no matter how honorable, replace the warmth of his arms around her on cold winter mornings? How could a few square feet of nylon encapsulate 3 years of whispered good mornings, of inside jokes, of plans of future? People approached her in constant waves during the wake, each one murmuring the same worn-out phrases. "My condolences. He's in a better place now. You're so strong. He'd be proud of how you're handling this." Sarah smiled politely and nodded at the right moments, but on the inside, she was screaming. She wanted to shake every person and yell, "You don't understand. He shouldn't be in a better place. He should be here with me, complaining about my bad coffee and leaving dirty socks on the bathroom floor." The worst was when people tried to find some meaning in his death. At least he died doing what he believed in. They would say, at least he was a hero. But Sarah didn't want a dead hero. She wanted her living, imperfect, and wonderfully ordinary fiancé back in her arms. When she finally got home after the funeral, exhausted and emotionally numb, Sarah sat on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by boxes of James's personal belongings that the Army had sent. It was surreal to see someone's life reduced to a few cardboard boxes. His clothes still smelled like him, a complex mixture of his lavender soap, that cheap aftershave he bought at the supermarket, and something undefinable that was uniquely James, something she could never describe but would recognize anywhere. She held his military dog tags, feeling the cold metal against her warm palm, and somehow hoped they would be warm, that they would carry some trace of his life, some echo of his essence. But they were just cold metal, engraved with numbers and letters that now seemed like a code for a person who no longer existed. Jessica, her best friend since college, a witty redhead who had always known exactly what to say in any situation, sat down beside her on the messy rug among the boxes. For the first time since Sarah had known her, Jessica seemed lost, as if all her words of comfort had dried up. The grief counselor says denial is normal in the early stages, Jessica began hesitantly. But Sarah, you have to start accepting that. They never found his body, Jess. Sarah interrupted, her voice laden with a desperate hope that was painful to witness. What if he's just missing? What if he's hurt somewhere trying to get home? What if he's in a hospital and can't communicate? Jessica exchanged a worried look with Sarah's mom, who had quietly entered the room carrying a tray with tea that no one would drink. It was the kind of look adults exchange when a child still believes in Santa Claus at 15, a mix of tenderness, alarm, and a deep sadness at having to be the one to shatter the illusion. "Honey," Jessica said gently, choosing each word as if she were defusing a bomb. The explosion was very violent. There was nothing left to find. The Army doesn't declare someone dead unless they are absolutely certain. Sarah squeezed the dog tags harder, as if she could extract life from them through pressure, as if she could force them to pulse with James's heartbeat to the sheer intensity of her need. "I can feel him. I can feel that he's still alive. It's not wishful thinking. It's a connection. We had a connection." The following weeks turned into months, and Sarah developed a peculiar routine of active denial. She kept James' side of the bed exactly as he had left it, his magazines piled on the nightstand, his alarm clock still set for the time he used to wake up to work out. She cooked for 2 people and set a plate for him at the table, explaining to anyone who asked that it was just force of habit. This was how Sarah found her life. Waiting for a ghost, talking to photographs when she thought no one was watching, refusing to accept a world where James didn't exist. She attended therapy sessions as an empty ritual, sitting before Dr. Williams, a gentle 60-year-old psychologist who had guided hundreds of people through the valley of the shadow of death. Dr. Williams had a calm, maternal way of speaking that usually soothed her patients, but only irritated Sarah. The office smelled of lavender and had green plants everywhere, as if the abundant life could somehow compensate for all the death that was discussed within those walls. "Grief is not linear, Sarah," Dr. Williams explained patiently during one of their mandatory weekly sessions. Therapy had been a condition of her parents for them to continue helping her financially. But clinging to false hope can prevent true healing. It can keep you stuck in a state of denial that doesn't allow you to process the loss properly. "It's not false hope. It's faith. It's love," Sarah replied, her voice shaky but determined, like a child defending the existence of the Easter Bunny in the face of overwhelming contrary evidence. Dr. Williams leaned forward slightly, her kind eyes focused intently on Sarah's face. "What would James want you to do? If he could see you now, what would he say?" The question pierced Sarah's carefully constructed defenses like a sharp arrow hitting the bullseye. Her composure, maintained through sheer willpower and anti-anxiety medication, finally shattered like glass. "He'd want me to live, to be happy. But how can I be happy without him? How can I just move on as if he never existed?" The tears she had repressed for months finally came, not the delicate, cinematic tears of romantic movies, but deep, guttural sobs that shook her like internal earthquakes. It was as if the entire ocean of pain she had been holding inside, dammed up behind a wall of denial and false hopes, had finally broken its banks and was flooding everything in its path. Months passed in a haze of weekly therapy, antidepressants that made her feel as if she were living underwater, and the well-intentioned but ultimately useless efforts of friends and family to bring her back to life. Sarah learned to function, waking up when the alarm went off, going to work and feigning normalcy for 8 hours, eating enough not to worry anyone, sleeping with the help of medication. But functioning was not the same as living. She existed in a state of suspended animation, like an actress playing a role of a normal person, while her true essence remained frozen in the moment those two officers showed up at her door with their grave expressions and their words that changed everything. It was on an especially lonely autumn night, almost a year after she had received the news that shattered her life, that Sarah finally made a decision. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside. She held the engagement ring, that perfect circle of gold and diamonds that had represented eternal promises and bright futures, but which now seemed mockingly expensive for something so useless. It was a beautiful ring, she had to admit. James had saved for months to buy it, working overtime and cutting back on everything else, so he could give her something that was worthy of the love they felt. The diamond caught the light from the desk lamp and broke into tiny rainbows that danced on the walls, beautiful but completely purposeless now, with hands that trembled only slightly, a significant improvement compared to the violent tremors of the first few months. She placed the ring in a small velvet box she had kept in her jewelry drawer. The action was both symbolic and terrible. She was literally closing the door on a life that would never happen. When the phone rang that night and Jessica's name appeared on the screen, Sarah knew instinctively that this would be a pivotal moment, one of those moments that divides a life into before and after. "Hi," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly calm considering the storm of emotions swirling in her chest. "Sarah, there's someone I want you to meet," Jessica said cautiously, as if she were crossing an emotional minefield. "A friend from work. David. He's a really nice guy. Gentle. He lost his wife 2 years ago in a car accident, so he understands about loss." Sarah looked at the box with the engagement ring on the table, then at the photograph of James on a nightstand. That favorite photo of hers where he was laughing at some joke she had told, his eyes shining with that genuine joy that made her fall in love with him over and over again every day. For one insane moment, she could have sworn he was smiling at her differently, as if he were giving her permission to move on, as if he were whispering that it was okay, that she deserved to be happy even without him. "Okay," she said finally, the words coming out in a whisper she barely recognized as her own voice. "Okay," Jessica repeated, disbelief clear in her voice. "You mean you're actually willing to meet someone?" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling something shift in her chest. Not exactly hope, which still seemed like a distant and impossible emotion, but perhaps the distant memory of what it was like to feel hope, like an echo of a song you used to love but can no longer remember the lyrics. "It's time. James would want me to try." The phrase came out with more conviction than she felt. But sometimes you have to fake courage until it becomes real. She looked at the box with the ring one last time, her tears falling silently onto the velvet lid. Maybe it's time to let go. And so, surrounded by the ghosts of a future that would never happen and the ashes of dreams that had turned into nightmares, Sarah took the first hesitant step towards something that might, eventually, look like a new life. She didn't know if she would be happy again. The word happiness still seemed to belong to a foreign vocabulary, but maybe she could learn to exist without the constant pain that had become her most faithful companion. The apartment was silent except for the familiar tick-tock of the clock. But for the first time in months, Sarah wasn't counting the minutes until a return that would never come. Instead, she was trying to imagine, with a cautious and terrifying curiosity, what it would be like to count minutes towards something new, something unknown, something that might perhaps be called a future. What happened next defied every law of probability, every expectation of reality, and every broken heart that had ever dared to hope again. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the universe conspires to rewrite the cruelest endings into the most beautiful beginnings. And what Sarah discovered on that bridge would not only resurrect her shattered world, but prove that some promises transcend even death itself. The autumn wind carried whispers of change through Central Park as Sarah stood on that same bridge where her fairy tale had begun 3 years ago. Her trembling fingers clutched the velvet ring box, the weight of letting go pressing against her chest like a physical ache. The golden hour light painted everything in amber nostalgia, mocking her with memories of happier times when James had dropped to one knee in this exact spot. She had come here to say goodbye, to finally release the ghost she'd been holding on to for 18 months since that devastating knock on her door. The military officer's words still echoed in her mind like a death sentence repeated on an endless loop, killed in action. Those 3 words had murdered her future, buried her dreams, and left her existing in a hollow shell who she used to be. But David was waiting. Sweet, patient David who held her hand through panic attacks and never complained when she whispered James's name in her sleep. David who deserved a woman capable of loving him completely, not the fractured remnants of someone still haunting her own life. The engagement ring caught the dying light, its diamond surface reflecting 1,000 tiny suns, each one a memory she needed to release into the wind. Sarah's mother had been right. The grief counselor had been right. Even James, in their final video call, had made her promise to live if something happened to him. Everyone who loved her had been telling her the same thing for months. It was time to let go. Time to choose the living over the dead. Time to stop waiting for a miracle that would never come. The park bustled with evening joggers and couples stealing romantic moments, their laughter and conversation creating a symphony of life that felt foreign to Sarah's ears. She had become fluent in silence, in waiting, in the terrible arithmetic of loss. But tonight, standing where her story with James had begun, she would write its ending. She opened the ring box one final time, studying the princess-cut diamond that had once represented forever. James had saved for months to buy this ring, working overtime at the construction site while attending weekend Army Reserve training. She remembered how nervous he'd been that evening, how his hands had shaken as he'd fumbled with the box, how his voice had cracked when he'd asked her to be his wife. A tear splashed onto the ring's surface, distorting her reflection into fractured pieces. How do you say goodbye to the love of your life? How do you close a book when your heart insists the story isn't finished? Sarah had asked herself these questions every day for 18 months, and tonight, finally, she thought she had found the answer. She would throw the ring into the lake below, watch it sink beneath the dark water, like the dreams it had once symbolized. She would walk away from this bridge and never look back. She would call David and tell him she was ready to try, really try, to build something new from the ashes of what she'd lost. She would choose life over memory, hope over grief, tomorrow over yesterday. Sarah raised her arm, the ring box balanced in her palm, gathering the courage for one final act of letting go. The words came in a whisper, carried away by the autumn wind before they could fully form. I'm sorry, James. I'm sorry I couldn't wait forever. But as her arm began its downward arc, as the ring box started its journey toward the water below, something impossible happened. Something that would shatter every certainty she'd built around her grief and rebuild her world in the space of a single heartbeat. A voice spoke her name, not the voice of a stranger or a friend, not the echo of memory or the trick of a desperate mind. The voice that had whispered, I love you 1,000 times, that had promised come home, that had haunted her dreams and sustained her through the darkest nights of her soul. Sarah, time stopped. The earth ceased its rotation. Every molecule of oxygen fled from her lungs as she turned, knowing that what she would see couldn't be real, couldn't be possible, couldn't be anything more than her mind's final, cruel joke on her shattered heart. But there he was. James Mitchell stood 20 feet away, leaning heavily on a walking cane, his once perfect military posture now slightly stooped, his face bearing new lines and scars that told stories of unimaginable hardship. His hair was longer, grayer at the temples, and his left eye bore the faint trace of an old injury. He was thinner, wearing civilian clothes that hung loose on his frame, but his eyes, those warm brown eyes that had looked at her with such love on this very bridge, those eyes were unmistakably, impossibly, miraculously his. The ring box slipped from Sarah's frozen fingers, clattering against the bridge's wooden planks with sound that seemed to echo across the entire park. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process the impossibilities standing before her. This was a hallucination. This was grief-induced psychosis. This was her mind finally snapping under the weight of 18 months of unbearable loss. But hallucinations don't cast shadows. They don't disturb the evening air with their presence. They don't look back at you with eyes full of love and pain and desperate hope. This isn't real, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her hammering heart. This isn't real. This isn't real. She repeated the words like a mantra, like an incantation that might dispel whatever cruel vision her broken mind had conjured. James took a tentative step forward. favoring his right leg, the walking cane clicking against the bridge's surface. "I know this is impossible," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I know they told you I was dead. I know you had a funeral, that you buried me." "Sarah, I am so sorry." The sound of his voice, not a memory, not an echo, but real and present and alive, sent shockwaves through every nerve in Sarah's body. She pressed her hands against her ears, shaking her head violently. "No, no, no. I buried you. I watched them lower your casket. I threw dirt on your grave. You're dead, James. You're dead, and I'm going crazy." "Look at me," James pleaded, taking another careful step closer. "Really look at me. I'm here. I'm alive. I came back, just like I promised." Against every rational thought screaming in her head, Sarah lowered her hands and forced herself to focus on the man before her. She cataloged every detail with scientific precision, searching for flaw that would reveal him as the figment of her traumatized imagination he had to be. But the more she looked, the more real he became. She could see the slight tremor in his left hand, the way he shifted his weight to accommodate what was clearly a significant leg injury, the network of small scars across his cheekbone that spoke of violence and survival. This wasn't the perfect, unmarked James of her memories. This was a man who had lived through hell and somehow found his way back to her. How? The word escaped her lips like a prayer, like a plea, like the first word spoken in a language she'd forgotten how to speak. James's eyes filled with tears as he struggled to find words adequate for the impossible. The explosion that supposedly killed me, it did kill the 3 soldiers I was with. I was thrown clear, knocked unconscious, suffered a severe head injury that gave me amnesia. Local villagers found me, took me to a hidden clinic run by doctors who were sympathetic to Americans but couldn't risk exposure by contacting military authorities. Sarah's legs trembled, threatening to give out beneath her. She gripped the bridge's railing for support as James continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, as if telling the story was bringing him back to life. "I had no memory of who I was, where I came from, nothing. The doctors said it was severe retrograde amnesia caused by the traumatic brain injury. For months, I was just a man with no past, recovering from injuries I couldn't remember receiving. The villagers called me the Lost American. I learned their language, helped in their fields, became part of their community, while my memories remained locked away." "But how?" Sarah started, then stopped, unable to formulate complete thoughts through the storm of emotions raging in her chest. "It was your engagement ring that brought me back," James said softly. "One of the doctors had found it on me when they first brought me in, along with my dog tags. They kept it safe, hoping it might help restore my memory someday. 8 months after the explosion, I was helping repair the clinic's roof when I fell and hit my head again. When I woke up, everything came flooding back. Your face, your voice, the way you laughed at my terrible jokes, the way you felt in my arms." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her throat, where she could feel her pulse hammering against her fingertips. This was too detailed, too specific, too heartbreakingly real to be a delusion. "The moment I remembered you, I knew I had to get home," James continued, his voice breaking with the weight of everything he'd endured. "But I was in a remote village in a war zone, with no papers, no identification, and a body that was still healing from massive trauma. It took me 10 months to make the journey back to American soil. 10 months of traveling through mountains and deserts, hiding from patrols, working passage on cargo ships, all while my leg infection got worse and worse." He paused, looking down at the walking cane in his hand, as if seeing it for the first time. "I've been in a military hospital in Germany for the past 3 months, undergoing surgeries, physical therapy, psychological evaluation. The Army had to verify my identity, conduct extensive interviews to confirm my story. They had to be absolutely certain I wasn't an enemy agent or a case of mistaken identity." Sarah felt the world tilting beneath her feet, reality reshaping itself around this impossible truth. 3 months, she whispered. "You've been alive and in a hospital for 3 months. I wanted to contact you the moment they confirmed who I was," James said urgently, as if he could sense a growing anguish. "But the doctor said I needed to be stable first. That reaching out to you while I was still in critical condition would be cruel. They made me wait until I could walk, until I could speak without slurring, until I could promise them I wasn't going to die from my injuries. Die from your injuries? Sarah repeated numbly. The words felt foreign in her mouth, like she was speaking a language from another planet. James nodded grimly. The infection in my leg was severe. There was talk of amputation. For weeks, the doctors weren't sure I would make it. They said contacting my family to tell them I was alive, only to have me die a few days later, would be more traumatic than letting everyone believe I was already gone. Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process the magnitude of what he was telling her, while she'd been grieving his death, planning his funeral, slowly trying to rebuild her shattered life. He had been fighting for survival in a hospital bed thousands of miles away, while she had been throwing away their wedding magazines and boxing up his belongings. He had been relearning how to walk, desperate to get home to her. But I'm here now, James said, taking another step closer. I kept my promise, Sarah. I came back to you. The evening air between them crackled with tension and disbelief and 18 months of accumulated grief. Sarah stared at this man who claimed to be her dead fiancé, searching his face for confirmation of the miracle that defied every law of reality she understood. Prove it, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her racing heart. If you're really James, prove it. Without hesitation, James began to speak, his voice soft and intimate, sharing memories that only the two of them could know. The first night we spent together, you made me watch 4 romantic comedies in a row, and I pretended to hate them even though I secretly loved seeing you laugh. You have a tiny scar on your left shoulder from when you fell off your bike trying to impress me during our second date. You sing off-key in the shower and think I can't hear you, but I love it anyway. When you're nervous, you twist your engagement ring around your finger exactly 7 times. You did the entire night before I deployed. Each memory hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing her breath and flooding her eyes with tears. These weren't facts that could be researched or guessed. These were the intimate details of their shared life, the small moments that had built their love story one day at a time. The morning I left for deployment, James continued, his own tears now falling freely. You made me pancakes shaped like hearts, and we ate them in bed while you cried and tried to pretend you weren't crying. You made me promise to come home for our spring wedding, and I told you that wild horses couldn't keep me away from marrying you. Sarah's composure finally shattered completely. A sound escaped her lips, part sob, part scream, part prayer, as a full reality of what was happening crashed over her like a tidal wave. This was real. This was James. This was her miracle. She began moving toward him slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, reality seeming to shift and bend around this impossible moment. When she was close enough to touch him, she stopped, her hand hovering inches from his face. If I touch you and you disappear, I think it might actually kill me, she whispered. James smiled through his tears, the expression so achingly familiar that Sarah's knees nearly buckled. I'm not going anywhere ever again, he promised. I've spent 18 months trying to get back to you. Wild horses, remember? Sarah's fingertips made contact with his cheek, tracing the new scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. His skin was warm and real and alive beneath her touch. He was solid, present, breathing. Her James returned from the dead like something out of fairy tale. You're real, she breathed, the words coming out like a revelation, like the first words spoken in a newly discovered language. You're actually real. James caught her hand in both his, pressing her palm against his chest where she could feel his heart beating strong and steady and undeniably alive. I'm real. I'm here. I'm never leaving you again. The dam of 18 months of grief, rage, hope, and despair finally burst. Sarah collapsed against James's chest, her sobs echoing across the park as he wrapped his arms around her, holding her with the desperate strength of a man who had crawled back from the dead for the chance to hold her again. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair, his own tears falling like rain. I'm so sorry you went through that. I'm sorry you had to bury me, had to grieve me, had to live with that pain. I knew, Sarah gasped against his chest. Some part of me always knew. Everyone told me to let go, to move on, but something inside me refused to believe you were really gone. They held each other as the sun continued its descent behind the Manhattan skyline, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Other park visitors gave them a wide berth, instinctively recognizing that they were witnessing something sacred, something that belonged entirely to these two souls who had found each other across an impossible divide. When Sarah's sobs finally subsided enough for her to speak, she pulled back to look at James's face, memorizing every new line and scar, as if she could burn his image into her retinas. "I was about to throw your ring into the lake," she confessed. "I came here tonight to let you go, to finally move on." James glanced down at the ring box lying forgotten on the bridge's planks. "Maybe I should pick that up before someone mistakes it for litter," he said with a hint of his old humor. Sarah laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in 18 months. The sound was rusty and broken but genuine. "That's not funny," she protested, even as she continued to laugh. James retrieved the ring box with some difficulty, his injured leg making the movement awkward. When he straightened, he looked at Sarah with an expression of profound uncertainty. "I know this is crazy. I know you probably have a life now, maybe someone new. I know I can't just show up after 18 months and expect." "James," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm despite her tears. "I need you to understand something. I buried you. I grieved you. I tried to move on, but I never stopped being yours. Not for a single day." The relief that washed over James's face was so profound that Sarah felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. But then his expression grew troubled again, and she could see him wrestling with something painful. "I'm not the same man who left," he said quietly. "The injuries, the memory loss, the things I've seen, I'm broken in ways I'm still discovering. I have nightmares. I panic in crowds. I can't run anymore because of my leg. The doctors say I'll probably always need the cane. I'm not the man you fell in love with." Sarah cupped his face in both hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Do you remember what you said to me the night before you deployed? When I was crying about how long you'd be gone, how much might change?" James searched her face, then his eyes softened with recognition. "I said that love isn't about loving someone because they're perfect. It's about loving them through all their imperfections." And what did I say back? A ghost of a smile played at the corners of James's mouth. "You said that as long as you came back with your heart intact, everything else was just details." Sarah smiled through her tears. "I meant it then, and I mean it now. You came back to me. That's all that matters." James looked down at the ring box in his hands, then back at Sarah's face. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself to one knee on the bridge's wooden planks, just as he had 3 years ago when their story began. "Sarah Thompson," he said, his voice strong despite the tears streaming down his face. "I know I'm not the same man who proposed to you on this bridge. I know you're not the same woman who said yes. We both been through hell, and we're both different people than we were before." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a rebirth, a chance to choose each other again with full knowledge of what love could cost and what it could survive. "But if you'll have me," James continued, opening the ring box to reveal the diamond that had symbolized their first beginning. "If you're willing to marry a broken soldier who might have nightmares and will definitely have scars, who might need help some days and who will love you every day for the rest of his life, will you marry me? Again? For real this time?" Sarah looked down at this man who had literally fought his way back from the dead to keep his promise to her. She thought about David, sweet and patient and safe, waiting for her in a life that suddenly felt like someone else's dream. She thought about the friends who would encourage her move on, the therapist who had helped her process her grief, the mother who had watched her daughter disappear into sorrow and slowly claw her way back to some semblance of living. None of that mattered now. None of it had ever really mattered. There was only this, James on his knees before her, offering her their second chance at forever. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying the weight of 18 months of pain and hope and love that had refused to die. "Yes, I'll marry you. Again. For real this time." James slipped the engagement ring back onto her finger where it always belonged, where it would stay until the end of time. The diamond caught the last rays of sunlight, throwing rainbows across their tear-streaked faces like nature's own blessing on their impossible love story. As James struggled to his feet, Sarah threw her arms around his neck, kissing him with all the passion and grief and joy and relief of a woman who had been given back her heart. The kiss tasted like tears and promises and second chances, like all the words they hadn't been able to say and all the time they thought they'd lost forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing through their tears, James rested his forehead against hers. "So," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "when do you want to have that spring wedding?" Sarah's laughter bubbled up from somewhere deep in her chest, bright and effervescent and alive. "How about tomorrow?" she said. "I've kept that dress in storage long enough." "Tomorrow might be rushing it a bit," James replied, his eyes twinkling with the humor she'd fallen in love with years ago. "But spring sounds perfect. We got some catching up to do first." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Central Park, Sarah and James walked slowly off the bridge where they'd found each other twice now, heading toward a future that had once seemed impossible, but now stretched before them filled with infinite possibility. Behind them, forgotten on the bridge's railing, sat a small plastic bag containing the wedding magazine Sarah had thrown away 18 months ago, then secretly retrieved from the trash the next morning, because some part of her had refused to let go of hope. She'd kept them hidden in her closet like a shameful secret, a testament to her inability to fully accept the reality of James's death. Now, as they walked away hand in hand, Sarah made a mental note to dig those magazines out of storage. After all, they had a spring wedding to plan. And this time, nothing, not war, not injury, not even death itself, would keep James from showing up to marry the love of his life. The impossible had happened. Love had conquered death. And somewhere in the universe, the forces that govern second chances and happy endings and the triumph of hope over despair smiled down on two souls who had proven that some promises are truly worth waiting for, no matter how long the wait might be. Their story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning.